Tonight we slip into the frost-bitten fog of medieval Iceland, a land where ghosts didn't just haunt the living, they haunted the legal system. You're wrapped in wool, trudging through a snow-blanketed valley toward a low, turf-roofed longhouse. Somewhere inside, by a flickering oil lamp, a man is scribbling a legal manuscript with a quill that may or may not have belonged to a dead man. His ink freezes between sentences. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, the law speaks of ghosts. And you probably won't survive this. I mean, statistically, ghost encounters don't go great in these stories. But at least you'll have legal recourse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing who's listening and where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start by walking straight into a peculiar paradox. Medieval Icelanders believed deeply in the supernatural, and they were lawyers about it. No, seriously. They treated hauntings the way we treat parking violations, by writing them down and assigning consequences. Picture this. You find a hand-copied medieval scroll, yellowed and stitched at the spine. Among statutes on sheep theft and boundaries, there's a clause forbidding the harboring of ghosts on your property. Not only could ghosts be considered a legal nuisance, but they were also sometimes treated like rogue citizens, troublemakers who just happened to be dead. One mainstream historical fact you probably didn't expect: the Gragas, Iceland's famous medieval law code, actually includes references to supernatural encounters, suggesting that law and law weren't so separate after all. It wasn't just about belief, it was about order. Iceland had no king, no standing army, and no central enforcement. So, the law had to do the heavy lifting. And that included keeping the dead in line. There's a beautiful absurdity here. In a society based so strongly on honor, memory, and storytelling, ghosts were more than spooky intrusions, they were uninvited participants in the legal narrative. If a ghost showed up at your farm and started throwing bowls or scaring sheep, you couldn't just say, "Bummer, guess I'll move." You had options. Legal ones. Of course, this creates a paperwork problem. If someone's haunting your outhouse, who do you tell? And how do you prove it? Icelanders got creative. Some communities treated ghost sightings almost like incidents to be reported. There are hints in sagas and surviving court records, though sparse, that people might bring such disturbances up at the Althing, Iceland's national assembly. Now, historians still argue whether these ghost laws were sincerely enforced or if they were more symbolic. Were these rules believed literally, or were they more like moral tales smuggled into official documents? Either way, the scribes didn't skimp on the details. One particularly fringe tidbit buried in a few regional variations. In some places, a haunted object, say, a cursed sword or a possessed chair, yes, really, could be cited as a kind of legal liability. Meaning, if you knowingly sold a haunted item, you might be legally liable for what it did to the next owner. As-is clauses were probably invented just for these situations. Imagine an old Icelander grumbling, "I told him the chest moaned at night. He still bought it. That's on him." So now you're curled in bed, listening, and maybe you're wondering, how did this all start? The answer lies in Iceland's legal DNA. It was a stateless society built on consensus and storytelling. Ghosts, as it turns out, made excellent characters in both. Their system, known as the Gragas, wasn't a top-down list of royal decrees. It was a social contract. Passed down orally, memorized with almost spiritual reverence, and eventually written down by monks and scribes, it covered everything from murder to manure and, yes, ghosts. If someone died under mysterious or violent circumstances and was later seen by others walking again, acting strange, or simply existing when they really shouldn't, people took it seriously. Ghosts weren't wispy Victorian clichés back then. They were physical. They smelled. They rotted slowly. And they got angry. And so the legal system adapted. Not just to protect the living, but also to maintain community sanity. You didn't want ghost hysteria. You wanted protocol. Take, for example, the case, likely fictional, but rooted in custom, of a farmstead where the milk curdled, the dogs howled, and the youngest daughter kept seeing her dead uncle in the rafters. That's not a spooky tale to laugh about at the hearth, it's a household crisis. In some variations, the family had to bring witnesses. They swore oaths. And then, if the haunting persisted, they could file for official action. In a few cases, that meant banishment of the ghost. We'll get to that later. But first, try to imagine how seriously a culture has to take its ghosts to write them into law. That's like Congress debating whether poltergeists can vote. And in Iceland, those debates happened on windswept plains under the open sky. Still not convinced. There's a preserved section in the Jansia law book, later than the Gragas, but still medieval, that hints at how the presence of a ghost on a farm could be considered a breach of peace. Like noise complaints, but spectral. The owners were sometimes held responsible for not clearing it out fast enough. And remember, this was a time when almost every natural misfortune could be spiritualized. A sick cow. Witchcraft. A blizzard that took your sheep. Divine punishment. A ghost at your door. Clearly, something had gone legally and cosmically wrong. If all this sounds like the world's most elaborate prank by your ancestors, I'm with you. But it's also deeply human. These people lived in isolation, in tiny, close-knit communities ringed by volcanoes and black beaches. When the long winter nights stretched on endlessly, and the snow covered the world in silence, they didn't just fear ghosts, they organized them. And now, here you are, centuries later, listening in the glow of your screen, as we resurrect these laws, these fears, and these half-frozen footnotes of Icelandic imagination. You've just crossed the threshold. No going back now. So, now that you've trudged through the snow-covered front door of medieval Icelandic lore, let's talk about the ghosts themselves. Not all ghosts were created equal, at least, not to the Icelanders. You might imagine a vague floating spectre with rattling chains, but they had a whole taxonomy of the undead, and the lines between ghost, revenant, and something else entirely were as murky as a volcanic hot spring. You're lying in your bed, but your mind is trekking through wind-scoured valleys again. Picture a burial mound half-sunken into the earth. It's said that the dead man inside still sits upright at night, glowing faintly. Does that make him a ghost, or something worse? You're not sure, and, honestly, neither were the lawmakers. The Icelanders had different terms for these phenomena. A draga was a reanimated corpse, corporeal, smelly, and fond of wrestling livestock or sitting on sleeping people's chests. Not ideal house guests. Then there were aptaganga, literally again-walkers, which were often the souls of people with unfinished business or who had died violently. Some were angry. Some were just confused. And then you had the more intangible vofa, shadowy apparitions that wafted in and out of people's lives like eerie drafts through a cracked door. But here's the bureaucratic twist. Icelanders didn't just fear these spirits. They categorized them, like tax accountants sorting receipts. Were you haunted by a draga or a vofa? That mattered. Especially if you were going to complain about it in court. Mainstream scholars agree that the most common type in Icelandic saga literature is the draga, a visible, tangible undead with serious attitude problems. Think zombie, but more organized. And probably still mad about that property dispute from 30 years ago. What's fascinating is how these classifications had real-world implications. If your farm was haunted by a vofa, people might suggest a prayer and a clean conscience. But if a draga showed up, that's a community threat. Sometimes, it took an exorcism. Sometimes, a violent reburial. Sometimes, just plain burning the corpse and the bed it died in. There's a fringe tidbit for you. In some saga versions, the lore allowed you to burn a haunted bed if it was deemed spiritually contaminated. No refunds, though. And yes, if you're wondering, this wasn't just folklore whispered on long nights, it worked its way into legal thinking. There were unofficial but acknowledged ghost typologies, just as there were classifications for livestock or boundaries. You wouldn't confuse a sheep with a goat, don't confuse a vofa with a draga. One chilling debate that historians still argue about: whether these ghosts were treated as metaphors representing guilt, trauma, or social unrest, or as genuine threats to body and soul. In other words, was the legal attention given to ghosts just symbolic language for human conflict? Or did people really believe a corpse could rip a roof off your barn? And here's where it gets gloriously Icelandic. The sagas blend everything together. They're legal, historical, and mystical all at once. In Eyrbyggja saga, for example, a whole area is plagued by ghost activity after a series of improper burials and family feuds. Ghosts start popping up like weeds. The local lawman has to step in not just to bless the area, but to sort out the underlying human issues. Ghosts are the symptom. Social breakdown is the disease. You sip imaginary tea and nod sagely. That actually makes sense. There's even this cheeky interpretation from some modern scholars that ghosts were Iceland's early warning system. If someone returned from the dead, it often meant justice had not been served, or someone had been wronged. The ghost, then, was a walking legal loophole, haunting not just a house but a broken system. In that sense, spectral justice wasn't a contradiction, it was a necessary extension of earthly law. And because medieval Iceland lacked a strong central government, community order depended on clarity. If you didn't sort out your feuds, bury your dead properly, and honor your oaths, your mistakes might rise up, literally, to haunt you. So when people wrote or recited laws about ghosts, they weren't just being dramatic. They were establishing boundaries. Emotional ones. Social ones. Sometimes even physical ones. Like, don't go near the barrow by the fjord after sunset unless you want to wrestle Uncle Thorstein again. It's worth remembering that Icelandic belief systems were a delicious stew of pre-Christian Norse cosmology and the creeping influence of Christianity. So some ghosts were thought to be restless souls denied peace. Others were demons in disguise. And others were just neighbors who refused to shut up, even after death. There's one peculiar case in a lesser-known tale where a ghost returned solely to argue over a pasture fence. Not to seek revenge. Not to curse anyone. Just to say, this stake is 3 feet too far west. That's commitment. You lie there, imagining a frost-bitten legal scroll with those words etched in ink. The ghost of Bjorn objects to the placement of the boundary post. Somewhere, a medieval clerk sighs and adds another line. And while it's easy to laugh, think about how this blurred line between the dead and the living helped people process grief, anger, even unresolved debts. Writing down a ghost's grievance was a way to externalize it. To control the chaos. You can't punch grief, but maybe you can outlaw its ghost. And when you wake up in the middle of the night, unsure if that creak in the hallway was the wind or something older, something watching, maybe you'll understand just a bit of why the Icelanders did what they did. They weren't just writing about ghosts. They were trying to make peace with them. You stand now in the wide-open valley of Thingvellir, where the mossy cliffs stretch like frozen waves and a glacial river slices the land in half. This is where law happened. Iceland didn't have courthouses, it had nature. Raw, wind-bitten, and loud with seagulls. And right here, you imagine, someone once stood up at the Althing, perhaps voice trembling, perhaps very sure of themselves, and made a formal complaint about a ghost. Thingvellir was the site of the Althing, the oldest parliamentary assembly in the world, founded around 930 CE. Every summer, thousands of Icelanders made the trek to this natural amphitheater to argue, settle disputes, trade horses, and maybe eat some questionable cheese. It was equal parts courtroom, festival, and medieval sleepover. And if you were lucky, maybe nobody died. The All-Thing wasn't some secret society. It was a community affair. You camped in tents. You heard speeches. You sold wares. You gossiped. And occasionally, yes, you debated whether a spectral cow murderer should be exorcised, relocated, or possibly sued. That's not a joke. The All-Thing processed disputes of every sort, and while formal legal texts like Graga's didn't always give detailed instructions on ghost litigation, the sagas strongly suggest that hauntings were absolutely discussed in these assemblies. If something was disturbing enough, if it involved death, property, or community well-being, it qualified. Ghosts, unfortunately for everyone involved, ticked all three boxes. Imagine being a goy, a local chieftain law speaker, and trying to keep a straight face while someone explains that their aunt's spirit is haunting the pantry and won't stop slapping the butter churn. That's one of the light ones. The darker cases involved death. People got sick. Livestock ran into the sea. Whole families abandoned their homes. Those stories weren't funny. They were legal emergencies. A well-known mainstream case. The saga of Erbygja, yep. That one again tells of a place so plagued by ghosts that a local priest had to intervene through formal channels. He didn't just pray, he summoned community leaders and legally dissolved the hauntings through a blend of ceremony, law, and burial rites. It was ghost law as crowd control. But here's the twist. These ghost cases were often used to expose deeper legal or moral failures. When a haunting happened, it was rarely just a haunting. It was a symptom. Maybe someone had been wronged and not compensated. Maybe a killer hadn't confessed. Maybe a burial was done improperly out of spite, laziness, or haste. Whatever the reason, the dead noticed. And they walked. So when a case was brought up at the All-Thing, the accusation wasn't simply there's a ghost. It was something is broken in the social fabric. The ghost was the proof. You could almost imagine someone calling for an audit. Historians still debate whether these assemblies actually passed ghost-specific rulings or simply used the stories to drive other decisions. Did they hand down verdicts like, "You are hereby ordered to rebury your uncle on drier land, and also apologize to his ghost"? Maybe not in those words. But functionally, yes. And remember, these weren't private matters. Iceland's legal system was performative. Cases were argued aloud, in public, often with dramatic flair. So if you were accusing someone of harboring an angry spirit, everyone heard about it. Reputation was on the line. That may be why ghost complaints weren't brought lightly. You needed witnesses, a pattern of events, and ideally, some community support. Here's a fringe detail you'll like. There were cases where a farm was legally deemed uninhabitable due to ghost activity. It's the medieval Icelandic equivalent of condemning a building because the poltergeist won't let people use the bathroom. People took these declarations seriously. A haunted property could lose value, be difficult to sell, or worse, become a liability. That's right, ghosts affected real estate law. If you knowingly sold a haunted house and didn't disclose the undead presence, you might be in for legal trouble. Centuries before Zillow, Icelanders were already worried about full disclosure. And if you think no one tried to game the system, think again. There are hints, just hints, that some landowners may have exaggerated ghost stories to discourage squatters, or manipulate land sales. Oh, that field over there. Definitely cursed. Nothing grows except bone shards. Real helpful during negotiations. You can practically hear the sarcasm dripping from some scribe's pen as they document the 9th haunting of the week. Thingvellir itself may not have had a literal ghost bench, but you can imagine it, can't you? A mossy stone where some poor guy stood, hands trembling, describing the shrieking shadow that threw sheep off a cliff. The other attendees sip their mead and nod. Sounds like a classic Draeger case. Gonna need a reburying. And maybe a poem. Because yes, poetry helped. Icelandic lore was heavily oral for much of its early life, and poetic memory aids were essential. There's no surviving ghost lore lullaby, but we can dream. And honestly, it'd slap. And if you're thinking this all sounds remarkably civilized for dealing with the undead, you're right. Icelanders had a thing about clarity. In a world where the nights were long and the landscape barely distinguishable from myth, legal systems became the anchor. Even if the storm was made of ghosts. So next time you think your HOA is too strict, imagine a medieval assembly debating whether your great-aunt's spirit is legally entitled to haunt the root cellar. And remember, if it made it to Thingvellir, it was serious. You wake up, or maybe you never quite fell asleep. The wind hisses outside your window like it remembers something, and you're still wandering through medieval Iceland, where even the dead have paperwork. This time, you're slipping into the warm glow of a turf house. Inside, a scribe dips a goose quill into ink thick as syrup and prepares to record something unusual, a ghost story that needs to be legally documented. Iceland in the High Middle Ages was no stranger to writing. Despite being sparsely populated and isolated by the North Atlantic, the island nurtured a rich literary culture. By the 12th and 13th centuries, they were producing the saga's epic blends of history, legend, and family drama that make Game of Thrones look like a neighborhood dispute over fence height. And within those pages, alongside the feuds and the sheep and the suspiciously intense glances across banquet tables, were ghosts. But more than just storytelling, Icelanders wrote for record keeping. They had law books like Graga's, literally Grey Goose, which sounds like a hipster gin but is actually a dense collection of early Icelandic law codes. The laws were memorized, recited, and eventually transcribed. And somewhere in that scribal tradition, ghost encounters were written down with remarkable specificity. Not because they were spooky, because they had consequences. Picture this. A man claims that his deceased neighbor has returned nightly to steal milk from the cows. He's not just telling the story around a fire to creep people out. He's making a legal record because milk theft, even by the dearly departed, affects livelihood. And if nobody does anything about it, it sets a precedent. If Bjorn's ghost can freeload milk every night, what's to stop Halla's ghost from wrecking the fish traps? So scribes wrote it down. And this is where the style gets weirdly procedural. Many of these ghostly accounts follow a structured pattern, almost like court depositions. The ghost appears. The living observe. The consequences follow. Someone, often a chieftain or priest, intervenes. There's a resolution, usually involving reburial, a Christian blessing, or in extreme cases, physical violence against the corpse. Then peace, until the next haunting. Mainstream historians note how this documentation pattern echoes legal prose. Even though you're reading about a phantom howling in the attic, it's written with the same deadpan seriousness as a livestock theft. Which makes sense, when you think about it. To the Icelanders, a haunting wasn't just an eerie vibe, it was a disruption of order. And if something disrupted order, it had to be documented. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some written ghost accounts even included names of witnesses. Literal ghost affidavits. On the night of Snorri's sheep's disappearance, 3 men swore they saw a figure matching the late Olafur crawling out of the burial mound. You can almost see the medieval Icelandic version of an insurance adjuster grimacing over the paperwork. There are a few debates circling among scholars about this practice. One hotly contested point: were these records intended primarily as legal documents or as literary constructs? In other words, was the goal to create binding precedent or just preserve communal law in the guise of legal language? Historians still argue whether these ghost depositions were ever brought into actual court sessions or remained localized, informal methods of conflict resolution. The line between lore and lore was deliciously blurry, and that fuzziness is where the Icelanders thrived. They didn't need to separate spooky from serious. They made spooky serious. Sometimes these written accounts even include the exact wording of curses, confessions, or pleas from the ghosts themselves. One revenant supposedly begged for Christian burial so it could finally stop wandering the sheep paths with frozen eyes. Which, honestly, is either deeply poetic or a warning to wear better shoes in the afterlife. Let's not forget who did the writing. Scribes weren't just clerks, they were knowledge keepers, often trained in monastic settings, balancing pagan memories with Christian dogma. When a ghost story got written down, it wasn't just to titillate. It was an act of curation, preservation. Almost like a haunting itself, one voice trying to reach across time. And you, lying there under the soft hum of a fan or maybe the ghost of central heating, are part of that chain. Because those accounts, they're still here. Copied, recopied, translated. Haunted not by spirits, but by relevance. Someone thought it was important enough to write that a woman heard her dead brother coughing in the hayloft. And someone else thought it important enough to copy that account centuries later. And now you're hearing it. Let's go deeper into the mechanics. Some of these documents even included solutions, standard protocols for how to resolve hauntings. A sort of if you see something, rebury something approach. The most common solutions were Christian burial rites, followed by calling in a priest or goy to perform legal ritual acts, reinterment in consecrated ground, public declaration of peace, or physical sealing of a mound. There's a record from one saga where a ghost keeps dragging itself into a house every night, leaving fish guts on the floor. No one's quite sure if it's meant to be metaphorical or just really gross. The solution? Dig up the corpse, move it 2 fjords over, rebury it with hymns. And it worked. Ghost-free floors ever since. Another account tells of a ghost haunting a child, whispering secrets until the boy nearly dies of fright. They solve it not by banishing the spirit, but by publicly acknowledging the ghost's identity and resolving the family dispute it was tied to. So yes, sometimes all a ghost wanted was a bit of recognition. Maybe a plaque. Or an apology. Here's the wild thing. These ghost reports weren't always marginalized. Some were copied alongside laws, genealogies, and land charters. If you squint, you realize the message was simple. This happened, and it mattered. You should remember it. So next time you feel that little chill, that sense that something unsaid still lingers in the room, think of a medieval Icelander scribbling furiously by candlelight, documenting the murmurs of the past with legal precision. Not to scare you. To make sense of it. You're walking now across frost-hardened ground, past sagging fences and low stone walls dusted with moss. It's dusk, but then again, in Icelandic winters, dusk is most of the day. Ahead, you see a small wooden cross, crooked, half-sunken into the earth. No name carved. Just a marker. This is where the real legal nightmares start, improperly buried bodies. In medieval Iceland, burial wasn't just spiritual. It was legal. Where someone was buried and how had tangible consequences for inheritance, social status, and yes, ghost prevention. You couldn't just toss Uncle Thora into the woods and hope for the best. That's how you got lawsuits. And hauntings. Proper burial grounds were crucial. Once Christianity took hold in the early 1000s, only church-consecrated cemeteries were considered legally and spiritually appropriate. If you buried someone outside of sanctified earth, whether out of haste, stubborn pagan loyalty, or just being too remote from a priest, the risk was twofold: legal disputes from the living, and spectral unrest from the dead. That's right. Illegally buried corpses didn't just rot awkwardly in the moss, they came back. Ghosts in the sagas often have a clear origin, an unsanctioned burial. Sometimes they're murder victims hidden in shallow graves, denied justice. Sometimes they're socially disgraced people, outlaws, suicides, or suspected witches excluded from holy ground. These unquiet dead didn't just moan in the wind. They tore up fences, scared livestock into cliffs, and even attacked sleeping relatives. Mainstream scholars agree, burial practices in Iceland had legal, social, and religious overlap. It wasn't enough to say goodbye, you had to do it right, or else. So imagine the scenario: your neighbor buries his cousin in a hillside behind the sheep pen. No priest, no rites, just a few rocks piled on top. A week later, your cows stop producing milk. Strange footprints appear by your door. People hear wailing at night. Then your son gets sick. Coincidence? Nope. Time to write a complaint. You march down to the local GOI and file a grievance, citing improper burial with resulting disturbance. That sounds absurdly bureaucratic, but it's effectively what happened. Ghosts, in these situations, were evidence of legal negligence. Here's where it gets wild. Some sagas describe people digging up improperly buried corpses, dressing them properly, performing a belated Christian funeral, and then, no more hauntings. It wasn't even about belief. It was about protocol. A haunting meant the system had been violated, and the only fix was to restore the balance. One fringe account involves a body that had to be turned around in its grave, because it had been buried facing west instead of east. Sounds like spiritual feng shui, but it had legal significance. Burial facing east was aligned with Christian resurrection theology. Facing the wrong way? Well, that's practically asking for undead nonsense. Historians still argue whether these burial-related hauntings were mainly metaphors, ways of expressing social guilt, or genuine beliefs. But that's the magic of Icelandic medieval thought. Metaphors and literal truth often walked hand in hand, sometimes in the same burial shroud. There's one tale of a dead woman who kept returning nightly to scream the name of her sister-in-law. Why? Because she'd been buried in her working clothes, not her funeral garments. That mistake was interpreted as both disrespectful and legally inappropriate. A formal complaint was made, the grave reopened, the body redressed, and miracle of miracles, the screaming stopped. Clothing mattered. So did position. So did location. Burial in the wrong district could prompt legal action from neighbors who believed the ghost was trespassing. Imagine zoning laws, but for hauntings. Sorry, your revenant isn't licensed for this fjord. Then you have the drama around murder victims. Iceland's legal culture was obsessed with compensation, wergild, or man price. If you killed someone, you didn't just say sorry. You paid. But if the body wasn't properly buried, or the killing wasn't acknowledged, the dead could rise and sue, not figuratively, but by haunting the killer until the family took legal action. One classic saga scene: a ghost shows up in the dream of a chieftain, revealing his killer's name. The next day, that chieftain brings charges to the local assembly, citing the dream as testimony. And nobody laughs. Because dreams were admissible. So were hauntings. If they came with enough community support, they counted. Icelandic law was pragmatic like that. If 10 people all saw the same ghost waving angrily at a certain field, maybe that field needs investigation. And if the haunting continued, the community had a responsibility. Reburying wasn't always a family affair. Sometimes, entire villages pitched in to disinter and reinter bodies legally. A formal apology might even be issued, not to the family, but to the dead person. This wasn't just appeasement. It was a way to prevent further legal entropy. A ghost was like a lawsuit walking around in a shroud. Here's another strange case. A body buried on disputed land caused both families to accuse each other of unquieting the dead. The solution? An impartial priest dug up the corpse and buried it on neutral ground, an actual ghost DMZ. Peace followed. Mostly. The takeaway? In medieval Iceland, Improper burial wasn't just bad manners. It was illegal. And if you ignored the rules, you didn't just get a slap on the wrist. You got a cold hand on your shoulder at 3 a.m. So if your ancestor came knocking tonight, whispering that their burial site was a bit off, maybe too close to a pigsty, maybe facing the wrong direction, you'd better start making arrangements. And maybe pack some east-facing candles. Because here, burial wasn't the end of the story. It was a legal beginning. Now you're standing at the edge of a rocky ridge, your breath turning to mist. Below, a narrow path winds between two farmsteads, one freshly built, the other long abandoned. But locals still talk about the feud between them, the kind that survives even after both families are buried. Some conflicts don't end with death. They get louder. Tonight, you're diving into a fascinating aspect of Icelandic ghost lore, hauntings as posthumous revenge. The idea that grudges could outlive the body and even affect legal matters years later is as Icelandic as fermented shark and passive-aggressive saga narration. See, the medieval Icelanders weren't big on letting things go. Their legal system, decentralized and often enforced through personal action, meant that conflicts simmered across generations. And when someone died without closure, say, murdered without compensation, or humiliated without restitution, they might return. Not to haunt randomly, but with purpose. Ghosts didn't just rattle chains or whisper nonsense. They pressed charges. That's the difference between your average haunting and an Icelandic one. Here, the undead might literally drag your name through the mud with receipts. In one well-known saga, a man named Glamour dies under mysterious circumstances, possibly cursed. Afterward, he haunts the area relentlessly, driving one man mad and causing others to abandon their homes. It's not just a scary story, it's a revenge plot. Glamour's ghost doesn't appear until his killer has safely evaded justice. And once it does, everything goes downhill, livestock disappear, people fall ill, children go missing. The implication? The living messed up the legal part. Now the dead are correcting it. Mainstream historians view these stories as reflections of Iceland's obsession with honor and justice. When official systems failed, when a killer wasn't punished or a land dispute remained unsettled, ghosts became the backup plan. They didn't just scare people, they served legal notice. One particularly odd case involved a man who was falsely accused of theft. He died in disgrace. A few months later, his ghost appeared in the dreams of all 5 people who had testified against him, demanding that they clear his name at the next thing, the public assembly. They did. His grave was reconsecrated, and the dreams stopped. That's not a haunting, that's a supernatural appeal process. Icelanders were so meticulous that they sometimes treated ghostly testimonies as evidence. If someone consistently appeared to the same group of people with the same message, it could be legally persuasive. The ghosts didn't lie, they litigated. There's a fringe tale about a ghost that returned not to haunt its killer, but to sabotage the inheritance of a distant nephew. Why? Because the ghost felt the will had been falsified. It whispered to the widow, disrupted paperwork. How? We're not sure, and reportedly caused the ink to vanish from key documents. Whether you believe it or not, the story made one thing clear: even the dead could still care deeply about property law. Historians still argue whether these hauntings reflected actual beliefs or functioned more like cautionary tales, social pressure in spooky costume. But in either case, the effect was the same. If you wronged someone, living or dead, you risked being haunted and sued by proxy. Here's a lighter detail to soothe the chills: not all revenge ghosts were angry. Some just wanted fairness. One widow claimed that her dead husband returned nightly not to frighten her, but to gently remind her that their neighbor still owed him 2 barrels of cod. She settled the debt, and the ghost, who had reportedly begun rearranging the furniture, disappeared. And while you might think this is just spooky folklore, these ghost stories were sometimes used to change legal outcomes. There's one saga where a chieftain refuses to accept that a haunting is real until the ghost appears before him, outlines the injustice, and demands restitution. The chieftain not only complies, but enshrines the act in writing. That ghost didn't just get revenge, it got legislation. Think about that. You're lying in your bed, trying to sleep, and your great-grandfather shows up, not with glowing eyes or rattling bones, but with a strongly worded legal complaint. One memorable story involves a dead woman who appears repeatedly at the door of her former enemy, each time carrying a bloody cloth. No words. Just the cloth. Eventually, the recipient confesses to a past crime. The cloth. A symbolic contract of sorts. The haunting ends with a public trial, and the ghost never returns. It's part horror, part courtroom drama, part moral parable. All Icelandic. Revenge wasn't always violent. Sometimes, it was strategic. Ghosts would mess with the environment, delay harvests, sour milk, knock over barrels of dried fish, all to nudge someone into doing the right thing. It wasn't about terror. It was about pressure. Ghosts as spiritual lobbyists. Even the legal term draga, often translated as revenant, carried layered meaning. It didn't just imply something undead. It hinted at unfinished business. A wrong that still echoed, a court case that never closed. And here's the kicker. People listened. Ghosts had reputations. If someone was known to be vengeful in life, their haunting carried more weight. Oh, yeah, that's Irika's ghost. He was petty before he died. Better go settle that land dispute. So maybe you shouldn't be afraid of the ghosts. Maybe you should be afraid of ignoring them. Because in Iceland, even the afterlife respected procedure. Which brings us to the final, unsettling truth. In medieval Iceland, the line between justice and haunting was paper-thin, and often, it was written on calfskin with a goose quill at midnight. You pass under a warped wooden arch, the kind farmers might use to dry cod or hang old tools. But tonight, it's just creaking gently in the wind, its rope not swaying like weary sentinels. Beyond it, you find a low stone building, half barn, half shrine, where records were once stored. This is where the magic happens. Not sorcery, though we'll get to that, but actual parchment, legal documents about ghosts. Yes, really. In medieval Iceland, someone actually sat down at a lopsided wooden desk, dipped their quill in ink, and wrote a formal report about a haunting. Welcome to the ghost clauses. By now, you've seen how hauntings could trigger legal repercussions. But how did those claims actually get written down? This is where medieval Icelandic legal culture goes from darkly fascinating to hilariously bureaucratic. Ghosts weren't just muttered about in taverns or whispered across smoky hearths. They made it into actual law books, not necessarily as standalone ghost codes, but as embedded clauses and curious annotations in broader property disputes, inheritance laws, or personal injury claims. Because sometimes, injury meant he fell off the roof while running from a corpse. Now, you might assume ghost-related law was rare. It wasn't. In a society where literacy was limited and oral tradition reigned supreme, the mere act of recording a supernatural event on vellum suggested serious intent. If it made it into writing, people took it seriously. So how did these ghost references sneak into legal documents? Usually through context. For example, a complaint might mention that someone failed to maintain a family grave, which then caused nightly disturbances. Or a land deed could include a quirky clause stating that if a certain burial mound began to weep blood again, the property could be returned without penalty. That's not poetic license. That's a legal contingency. Mainstream historians note that many Icelandic legal documents, especially those preserved in the Gragas, the Grey Goose Laws, contain strange references to omens, dreams, and hauntings as valid triggers for action. A dream about a deceased relative might legally justify a trip to the thing to renegotiate an agreement. That's right. Your ghost dream could become Exhibit A. Let's take a weirder one. In a lesser-known fragment of a land sale agreement, there's a line noting that the buyer assumes responsibility for all disturbances known and unknown, corporeal and ethereal. In modern terms, that's basically a haunted house disclosure. Historians still argue whether these lines were meant symbolically or literally. But considering how often disputes reference the actions of the dead, it's likely many people did believe the ghosts were real and that acknowledging them legally could prevent further escalation. One particularly compelling saga describes a man who includes a clause in his will that a certain field must never be plowed because a man wrongfully killed during a feud was buried there. The clause was enforced for over 3 generations. That's long-term ghost insurance. There's also the curious case of a property exchange that included a side agreement. Should the ghost of Joran appear at the window, the lease shall be voided. She did. It was. And how were these spooky additions written? Often in the same formal tone used for everything else. You won't find dramatic and low, the dead did rise language. Instead, it's delightfully dry. It has been observed that unusual manifestations have occurred in the guest house since the burial of the second son, and until such manifestations cease, said guest house shall be unoccupied. Quill. Ink. Haunting. Business as usual. Sometimes, scribes added marginalia, small notes in the sides of pages, hinting at ghost activity tied to legal cases. One even contains a doodle of a little stick figure with arms raised next to the phrase, "walks often." Whether that was an actual sighting log or just a bored scribe's joke, we'll never know. But the point stands, hauntings made it into the paperwork. And the tone? Always serious. No sarcasm. No footnotes like, "Yeah, this sounds nuts." That's what makes it even better. It wasn't funny to them. It was procedure. Want a quirky tidbit? One document from the 13th century includes a clause stating that if a known haunt appeared more than 7 times in a single winter, the affected household could be exempt from tithing. Imagine going to your local church and saying, "Sorry, Pastor. We've had 5 ghost sightings this week. Financial hardship." And it worked. This wasn't just about belief, it was about governance. Iceland didn't have kings or armies. Authority came from consensus, community, and record-keeping. So when a haunting threatened a family's ability to work, sleep, or live in peace, the only recourse was to codify it. There's even a famous case where a legal document references a haunting as evidence in a defamation suit. The claim that the ghost had appeared only after a rival spread rumors about the dead man's honor. Therefore, the ghost wasn't haunting the land, it was defending its reputation. That's right, ghosts had PR needs. And here's the deliciously bureaucratic cherry on top. Legal scribes were sometimes asked to investigate hauntings. Not to exorcise them, this wasn't Catholic Europe, but to determine if they constituted legitimate disruption under law. Imagine being the local legal guy, trudging through snow to interview someone's very annoyed grandmother about why her pantry ghost keeps moving the flour. Of course, not all ghost-related clauses were enforced equally. Some seem more ceremonial than practical. Others were clearly inserted under pressure, as if saying okay, we'll write it down. Please stop screaming about dead toffee in the barn. But the fact remains, in Iceland, legal texts didn't shy away from the supernatural. They wove it in, quietly, precisely, sometimes even with contractual consequences. So next time you sign a lease, maybe check the fine print. And if you ever buy property in Iceland, and it includes a hill called Sleepless Mound, maybe ask a few extra questions. Or at least pack an extra candle. Just in case. You're walking now along the edge of a windswept field, where pale grass snaps underfoot and the sun has decided it's not coming back tonight. Just past a mossy cairn, you see it, a turf-roofed farmhouse with smoke curling from its chimney like a lazy ghost itself. But the real story isn't inside the house, it's underneath it. Because this is where a haunting once started with something as mundane as a misfiled deed. Tonight, we descend into the bureaucratic depths of haunted property. Not metaphorically haunted, legally haunted. These were lands, homes, and fields where the dead made claims just as forcefully as the living. And the paperwork, yes, the actual legal documents, reflected that messy overlap. You might think, how could land be haunted and officially recognized as such? Easy. Medieval Icelanders lived close to the dead, both physically and conceptually. Burial mounds often sat just beyond the garden wall. Your great-uncle might literally be resting 5 meters from your chicken coop. If he was unhappy with your gardening techniques, he could theoretically protest, and if enough people noticed, the land could be labeled disturbed. One of the best-known examples comes from a saga where a family tries to sell a farmstead. Everything goes smoothly until the new owners report being harassed by an unseen force, cold winds through sealed doors, the sound of hooves on the roof, even the bed shifting on its own at night. The elders shrug. Oh, yes. That's probably Orvalda. He didn't want us to sell. The buyers attempt to annul the deal. Eventually, a settlement is reached. Part of the land is returned to the family, while the rest is consecrated with rituals and, get this, a contractual agreement that no more than one grave may be visited by torchlight per month. Not spooky enough for you? One fringe tale tells of a hill farm where a ghost cow, reportedly owned by a long-dead widow, continued to graze, visible only to those with unpaid debts. When a man refused to settle his rent, he claimed he was being chased each morning by a blue-eyed heifer that smelled of ashes. The ghost cow became such a local nuisance that neighbors demanded the farm's deed be reviewed. Eventually, it was sold back to the widow's descendants, who mysteriously never reported the cow again. The legal angle. The property was declared fretel, an anxious or troubled holding. It didn't mean you couldn't sell it, just that you had to disclose the disturbance. A kind of haunted house disclaimer, 900 years before Zillow got involved. Mainstream historians acknowledge that these property tales reflect Icelanders' unique blending of legal formality and spiritual belief. They respected the boundaries of land and death. And when those boundaries were crossed, it wasn't just a family problem. It became a community issue, and occasionally, a judicial one. Sometimes, the haunted designation wasn't even about spooky activity, it was about unresolved inheritance. Take the case of a burial cairn that sat on the edge of a disputed pasture. 2 cousins fought over the field. One died mid-feud. Months later, strange lights were seen dancing over the cairn at night. Noises, too. The surviving cousin insisted it was a message from the dead, asking to let the land lie fallow. He even brought the claim to a local assembly. The verdict? Until 3 winters pass without disturbance, the field shall remain untouched. Historians still argue whether these decisions were driven by fear, superstition, or social maneuvering. But either way, the ghost clause worked. And there were rules. You couldn't just claim a haunting for legal gain. There had to be consistency, witnesses, recurring signs, maybe a local seer's interpretation. This wasn't a free-for-all. It was regulated spooky real estate. One beautifully weird document, written in a mixture of Old Norse and clerical Latin, describes a property where a woman wrapped in frost walks nightly across the threshold. The haunting was so regular that the owners tried to sue the previous family for not disclosing it. Incredibly, they won partial restitution in goats. The ghost stayed. And how did one lift a haunted status? Sometimes with ritual, reciting names at dusk, leaving offerings, moving boundary stones. But often, it required legal action, mediation with the dead's living relatives, oaths of peace, or even amending the original deed to acknowledge the spirit's presence. This field belongs to John, excepting the corner beneath which Arnie lies, and may Arnie be left undisturbed. That's not just poetic. That's legally binding. Here's a quirky aside. Some old Icelandic contracts include phrases like "unless the dead object," or "so long as no disturbance arises from beneath." These weren't jokes. They were hedges against supernatural invalidation. Not unlike modern contracts that include acts of God. Only in Iceland, God wasn't the only one capable of voiding a sale. The most chilling part. Occasionally, these hauntings outlasted generations. There are recorded oral traditions of land that could not be sold, passed down only through family, because no outsider could tolerate the nightly visitations. It was called inherited unrest. Kind of like inheriting a really unpleasant timeshare. With ghosts. And yet, people adapted. They built doors facing away from burial mounds. They placed iron knives in door frames. Some even paid skalds, poet-historians, to compose verses praising the dead, hoping that kind words would settle restless bones. By the 14th century, fewer of these legal ghost references appear, perhaps because of Christian influence, or because more standardized law codes phased them out. But for several hundred years, haunted property law wasn't a curiosity. It was part of life. If you wanted peace, you had to negotiate with everyone who had a stake in your land, living or not. So, the next time you walk into a home and feel a chill in the air, ask yourself, is it the draft, or a forgotten clause, still waiting to be honored? Maybe, just maybe, that creaking sound upstairs is someone checking to see if you've been paying attention to the fine print. The floorboards creak under your step as you enter a longhouse used for seasonal gatherings. It smells of smoked fish, damp wool, and the ghost of too many arguments. Around the fire pit, carved benches still remember the weight of disputes, laughter, oaths, and once in a while, the appearance of something not entirely living. You sit where the elders once sat, where judgment was passed and disputes over land, blood, or goats were settled with solemn nods and a flick of a carved stick. But tonight's debate isn't about livestock. It's about whether ghosts could sue the living. And stranger still, sometimes, they kind of did. You might think legal personhood is a modern invention. But in medieval Iceland, agency was a more flexible thing. If someone was believed to be causing harm after death, and no living proxy existed to challenge, the law occasionally treated the ghost as a participant in legal negotiations. Not quite a plaintiff or defendant, but something like a stakeholder. So, what does it mean to grant the dead a say in the legal process? Let's start with the dom, or judgment, often delivered at the local thing, Iceland's open-air parliament. In cases where hauntings led to material damage, crops ruined, livestock lost, family members driven from their beds, petitioners could seek community arbitration. And sometimes, rather than punishing the haunted, the court aimed to appease the haunting. One mainstream historical example involves a community that issued a formal decree to cease hostilities toward the mound dweller. The ghost in question was reportedly that of a murdered man, buried hastily without rites. After repeated dreams shared by different townsfolk, the local leader organized a restitution ceremony, songs, offerings, and an amendment to the original burial site boundaries. In practical terms, it was a settlement. The community essentially ruled, yes, we wronged this spirit. Here's compensation. Please stop throwing sheep into the river. Quirky as it sounds, this fits within Iceland's legal logic. Their system emphasized social harmony, even if that meant respecting claims made by the restless dead. And if someone claimed a ghost was haunting them for a reason, say, unpaid debts or broken promises, the issue wasn't whether ghosts existed. It was whether the complaint could be resolved. Sometimes, the law worked backward. If a ghost appeared and was thought to be seeking justice, the living might be prosecuted or pressured to resolve the wrong. In one case, a woman began appearing in dreams to multiple witnesses, saying she'd been cheated out of a dowry. Her former suitor, still living, was taken to the thing and asked to account for the missing sum. When he did, and the money was quietly given to the woman's surviving brother, the visitations stopped. Historians still argue whether these cases were about supernatural belief or psychological coercion. Was it easier to admit guilt if the dead accused you? Or was the ghost just a socially acceptable excuse to right a hidden wrong? Either way, the pattern holds. The dead weren't outside the law. They were part of its tapestry. If someone died unjustly and no one avenged them, it was thought their ghost might wander until the law recognized their injury. In that sense, ghosts became legal pressure points, a haunting reminder, of unfinished business. Now here's a fringe tidbit. One tale mentions a ghost witness. During a feud trial, when both sides gave conflicting accounts, a third party claimed they'd heard the murdered victim speak in a dream, naming the real killer. And the court, while skeptical, it allowed the testimony into the record not as proof, but as moral insight. The accused fled shortly after. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the ghost had better lawyers. Even outside direct trials, ghosts affected legal outcomes. Families known to be shadowed by a haunting often found it harder to make contracts or arrange marriages. A persistent ghost wasn't just an annoyance, it was a liability. Some families responded by writing public oaths claiming innocence or denying wrongdoing, almost like spiritual PR campaigns. These oaths, when witnessed, had legal weight. And then there's the use of legal poetry, yes, poetry. Icelanders often composed verses, insult poetry, and drapa, praise poetry, not just to insult or honor the living, but sometimes the dead. In one curious account, a man is said to have composed a drapa to appease the spirit of a woman he never married, ending with a line that translates loosely as, "Let these words wrap you, since my arms could not." Legal scholars debate whether the verse was meant to close a contract of betrothal, posthumously. Either way, the ghost vanished soon after. The law even addressed exhumation. Disturbing a grave without cause was illegal, but doing so with legal justification, like moving a ghost's body to a more peaceful site, could be allowed. One surviving document outlines a peace relocation of remains, authorized by local leaders, to restore harmony between kin and field. Imagine getting that court order today. Here's a delightfully weird clause. In one law book, there's a line stating that no debt may be collected from the tongue of the dead. It sounds poetic, but it's likely a legal ban on using ghost testimony to demand payments. A precaution against spectral loan sharks. Of course, not all ghostly claims made it to court. But enough did to warrant their inclusion in community memory and, occasionally, the legal scrolls. And remember, this was a society with limited written documentation. If it made the parchment, it mattered. This raises a big question. Were these rulings really about justice, or were they tools for controlling behavior? After all, if everyone believed the dead could call down legal consequences, then maybe people treated each other a bit more carefully. Ghosts as law enforcement. Creepy, but effective. And just imagine the quiet power of it. Knowing that even in death, you could speak through dreams, through trembling walls, through the uneasy glances of neighbors who felt your presence and heard your name in the wind. So yes, ghosts had a legal voice. Not loudly. Not always clearly. But in medieval Iceland, if you wronged someone, you might still face judgment, even if the judge came from the other side. You kneel now beside a shallow stream, fingers brushing against the icy water as it murmurs across black stones. Above you, the sky has turned slate grey, the kind of dull silence that settles over Icelandic valleys before a storm or a revelation. And tonight's revelation? Ghosts didn't just haunt homes or hover near burial sites. They had something to say. And more often than not, they said it through dreams. You've probably had strange dreams before. Maybe you forgot your locker combination, or maybe you showed up to school wearing someone else's teeth. But in medieval Iceland, Dreams were more than subconscious nonsense, they were serious communication channels, and sometimes, court-admissible evidence. Dreams were where the dead filed complaints. When you read the sagas, you'll notice how often someone wakes up pale, shaking, whispering, "I saw him. He spoke to me." The he in question was usually long dead, and whatever he said had consequences. These weren't just ghostly cameos. They were specific, actionable messages: return the brooch, apologize to my son, move my bones, finish the feud. And here's the eerie part: people listened. Take one mainstream example from Laxdæla saga. A woman dreams that her dead husband visits her, weeping. He accuses her new lover of theft and warns of bloodshed if justice isn't done. The woman is rattled enough to speak publicly about the dream. Tension rises, accusations fly, and sure enough, someone ends up very stabbed. Historians consider this one of the clearest cases of a dream being used to shape public opinion and drive legal action. Not because the ghost held a sword, but because the living took the dream as truth. This wasn't uncommon. People didn't dismiss dreams with a sleepy shrug. They might seek out a Volva, a Cirrus, or a wise elder to interpret the message. Was it a warning? A demand? A prophecy? In a society without lawyers on speed dial, dream interpreters were the closest thing to paranormal mediators. Now here's where it gets quirky. One saga tells of a man haunted not by a ghost's image, but by a dead uncle's dream scent. Each night, he dreamed of rotting hay and wet stone, the exact conditions of the uncle's unmarked grave. After enough nose-wrinkling nights, he exhumed the bones, reburied them properly, and the dreams stopped. Historians still debate whether this was metaphorical guilt or actual ghost BO. And sometimes, dreams included instructions for rituals, literal how-to guides from beyond. In Grettir's saga, a man dreams of an ancestor who tells him to carve runes into a sheep's skull and bury it by the hearth to ward off a revenant. He does it. The haunting stops. Later, another character dreams of the same ancestor, who now complains about the draft. Dreams, where even ghosts can nitpick your home decor. The legal weight of these visions varied. Some dreams inspired formal complaints or changed someone's legal strategy. Others led to out-of-court settlements, because honestly, if you're dreaming nightly of your late aunt tugging on your hair and pointing at your sister's missing necklace, you might just give it back to make it stop. Interestingly, there were rules about what kind of dream counted. A one-off nightmare after eating questionable seal meat? Probably just indigestion. But a recurring dream, shared by multiple people, featuring consistent details about events or injustices, that could be persuasive, especially if the ghost got specific about names, dates, or debts. There's one case where a dead woman reportedly appeared in the dreams of 3 different men from 3 different farms, asking for her comb to be returned to her grave. When one of the men confessed to having found the comb and keeping it, they reburied it. The dreams stopped. Case closed. Ghost appeased. The comb was probably hideous, but hey, peace is priceless. Fringe tales go even further. In one forgotten manuscript, there's a dream where a ghost instructs the dreamer to forge a legal seal and stamp it onto a hidden document buried with them. The dreamer, naturally skeptical, digs it up. And there it is, a forgotten agreement tucked into a bone-handled chest. Totally real? Who knows? But the story stuck around, which says something. Historians still argue whether dreams were really believed to be ghostly contact, or just socially acceptable ways to externalize guilt and communal secrets. Were people haunted by spirits, or by their own actions? It's a chicken and ghost situation. Dreams also helped communities enforce memory. If your great-grandfather was wronged and no one spoke of it, a well-timed dream could bring the injustice back to light. In a culture that treasured oral tradition, dreams were almost like backup archives, emotional records of unresolved pain or broken promises. Even the law speakers, the men who memorized and recited Iceland's legal codes at the Althing, sometimes mentioned dream messages as part of dispute resolution. Not as hard evidence, but as context. If someone was driven to confession or generosity by a dream, it wasn't ignored. The supernatural had social power, even if it didn't always wear a white sheet. It's also worth noting that some dream-visiting ghosts weren't angry. A few came just to say goodbye, or to warn loved ones of danger. One sweet account tells of a man whose mother appeared in a dream to urge him not to take the western road. He listened. That night, a mudslide wiped out part of the path. Whether it was luck or love, the message was taken seriously and preserved in family memory. And of course, there were dream visitations that didn't involve speech at all. Just presence. The weight of a ghost sitting on the edge of the bed. A cold hand brushing your cheek. A familiar shadow just beyond the firelight. Icelanders didn't need a ghost to speak in order to understand. Something wanted to be remembered. So tonight, as you drift toward your own dreams, imagine this. What if someone long gone still has something to tell you? What if that flicker at the edge of sleep is a story waiting to finish itself? And what if the quietest courtroom of all is the one behind your eyelids? You walk now into a small turf church, tucked into the hillside like it's trying not to be noticed. The wooden door groans as you open it, and the air inside is cool and still, smelling faintly of moss, beeswax, and very old secrets. The altar is plain. The pews uneven. But there's a sense that this place has seen things, weddings, funerals, maybe even the odd duel in the nave. And if you're wondering what happens when Christianity and ghosts collide, welcome to the next chapter of this very Icelandic haunting. See, medieval Iceland was a cultural casserole, pagan roots baked under a fresh Christian crust. The nation officially converted to Christianity in the year 1000 AD, mostly to avoid political awkwardness. The law speaker Orgir Ljósvetningagoy literally laid down after a long think and decided, let's all pretend we're Christian now. So they did. On paper. But belief. That took longer to change. Which means for a while, Icelanders lived in a strange twilight zone where Odin and Jesus might have shared pew space. And that includes how they treated the dead. In pagan tradition, the dead could linger physically. Barrow-wights and Draugr were expected to stomp around, guard treasure, or get grumpy if their burial conditions weren't up to code. After Christianity, these ghosts didn't vanish, they just got context. Now they were troubled souls, denied rest, trapped between this world and the next because something, usually sin or social messiness, hadn't been resolved. Mainstream historical records show that Icelandic clergy tried very hard to Christianize ghost beliefs. Priests gave sermons about proper burial rites, the dangers of dying unshriven, and the importance of keeping the churchyard holy. But they also knew their congregations. So rather than banning ghost stories outright, they gently reframed them. Take Erbygja Saga, an absolute gem of medieval mashup. It features a haunted church where the dead regularly show up for services. They sit quietly in the pews, mostly minding their own business, but their presence causes chills and dread among the living. Eventually, a priest with serious spiritual swagger exorcises them, not with violence, but by holding mass so powerfully that even the dead feel compelled to leave. The message: a good Christian can clean up even the ghostliest mess. That story, and others like it, show how Christianity didn't erase ghost traditions, it absorbed them. A haunting wasn't just spooky, it became moral. If you saw a ghost, it wasn't just because the spirit was restless. It might mean you had something to repent. But this created theological tangles. For instance, official Christian doctrine says that after death, souls go to heaven, hell, or, if they're lucky or unlucky enough, purgatory. So how do you explain Uncle Bjorn rearranging furniture in the middle of the night? That's where purgatory visitations come in. Some ghosts were interpreted as souls temporarily released from purgatory to ask the living for help, prayers, masses, candles. If you helped them, they might stop pestering you or even bless you in return. One record mentions a woman who saw her dead sister standing in the churchyard, weeping. The sister said, "Light 3 candles for me on 3 Sundays, and I shall sleep." She did. And she did. Historians still argue whether these were sincere spiritual experiences or clever mechanisms for fundraising. After all, candles weren't cheap. But the result was the same. The line between spiritual aid and supernatural maintenance got very blurry. Meanwhile, pagan practices didn't vanish. Some Icelanders continued burying their dead with personal items, or performing quiet rituals under the radar, like placing stones around a grave to contain a restless soul. A little Christian prayer, a little runic carving, just covering all the bases. One quirky tradition involved placing a consecrated wafer under a pillow to ward off nightmares. Not because people doubted the power of God, but because sometimes, even he needed a little help keeping the draugr at bay. Interestingly, some churches had architectural features designed with hauntings in mind. A few turf chapels were built with curved walls or deliberately uneven floors, based on the belief that spirits could only move in straight lines. So if a ghost showed up, maybe it'd get confused and wander back out the door. The holy version of a Scooby-Doo hallway trap. And remember those legal documents we talked about earlier? By the Christian era, exorcisms and blessings were occasionally written into land deeds. Like, this field comes with grazing rights, 1 rock pile, and a priest's blessing to keep dead Olaf from messing with your sheep. Spiritual insurance, 11th century style. But Christian influence wasn't all benevolent ghost wrangling. It also introduced the idea of heretical hauntings, the belief that some ghosts were demonic illusions, sent by the devil to test the faithful. This darker lens created fear around supernatural encounters. If you saw a ghost, maybe it wasn't your grandmother. Maybe it was something worse. Something trying to trick you. Which put people in an awkward position. Do I help this ghost or call a priest? Or both? That tension surfaces in Kristni Saga, where early converts wrestle with hauntings that don't fit neat moral categories. One priest tries to save a ghost with prayer, only to find the spirit getting stronger. He later admits, "I don't think that was a soul. I think it was something else." And then he moves. Smart man. This overlap of Christian doctrine and folk practice didn't just affect rural churches. Monks and scribes also encountered ghost lore, and sometimes recorded it, grudgingly, in the margins of religious texts. In one manuscript, a monk adds a note beside a psalm, "He appeared to Brother Lifer again this night. With the same bleeding hand. Mass has been ordered." Whether that note was a real report or a sleepy monk's way of staying awake, we'll never know. But the fact it's there tells you how normal this all was. In time, the church tried harder to standardize belief. Priests were trained to interpret dreams, denounce superstition, and urge proper burial rites. But the old ways lingered. You can still feel them in the soft silence of a turf church, where the past sits in every timber, and the shadows might not be entirely empty. So here, in this unlikely spiritual intersection, ghosts became not just folklore, but theology, legal anomaly, and emotional truth. They were the fault lines between belief systems, the flickers of unresolved ritual, and sometimes, the only voices brave enough to call out injustice in a world afraid to look too closely. Now you're trudging across a snowy fjord, boots crunching in a rhythm that feels both solitary and watched. Somewhere behind you, wind drags across the ice like a whisper with a grudge. And ahead, a cluster of old turf houses, their green roofs lumped like sleeping creatures under the weight of time. Inside those mossy walls, people once whispered ghost stories not just to scare but to settle things. Tonight, you're going inside to hear one that changed an entire village. Because sometimes, a ghost story wasn't just entertainment or warning. Sometimes it was history wearing a bedsheet. And in the case of one particularly sticky haunting, it was also, weirdly, a form of conflict resolution. You remember Erbygja saga, right? That chaotic classic full of revenants, questionable ethics, and the medieval version of crowd control? Well, welcome back to the Westfjords, where Iceland's most infamous ghost outbreak took on legal, spiritual, and social dimensions all at once. This is the tale of Water hauntings. It begins innocently enough. A man named Thorod, a merchant of some repute, drowns at sea. A tragedy, yes, but nothing supernatural. His widow, Thorgunna, prepares a funeral feast. Good food, good drink, respectful mourning. But then, Thorod and his drowned crew start showing up. Not in dreams. Not in spooky glimpses. They just walk back into the house. Sit down at the fire. Drip seawater on the floor. At first, the household is polite. "Oh, welcome back. Have a seat. Sorry about the drowning." You know, the usual. But the undead visitors say nothing. They just sit. Day after day. Cold. Wet. Silent. This goes on for months. Here's where things get wild and historically juicy. The saga presents this not just as creepy folklore, but as a real disruption to household dynamics. People start arguing. Food goes bad. Workers quit. Tensions rise. Eventually, the ghostly guests begin dragging others to their deaths, one by one. A haunting turns into a contagion. Historians still debate whether this saga reflects an actual belief in ghost plagues, or if it's an allegory for unresolved grief and social breakdown. But either way, the people living through it didn't wait for metaphors. They needed solutions. So what did they do? They called a thing a local assembly. Yes, that's right. They held a public meeting to address the ghost problem. A kind of medieval town hall, minus the PowerPoint. This was legal ghost busting. The thing wasn't just for crimes or land disputes. It was where people aired grievances, declared intentions, and sought consensus. So when the undead kept showing up at dinner uninvited, calling a thing was a natural next step. After all, if ghosts could be named in documents and blamed in deaths, why not involve the community? At this assembly, they debated the root cause. Was it improper burial? Incomplete funeral rites? Unpaid debts? Religious offense? Everyone had a theory. Eventually, they agreed on a plan, a mass exorcism. But not the fire and brimstone kind. This was procedural. The priest led a formal ceremony, invoking God's name and reading specific passages designed to force the dead into rest. People fasted. Prayers were said. And one by one, the ghosts disappeared. The saga tells it with eerie understatement. After the rite, it says simply, from that day forth, no man was seen again who had died by sea. You imagine the villagers standing there, wind whipping at their cloaks, eyes wide. No more dripping footsteps. No more silence. Just peace. Quirky side note, one of the ghosts, a man named Kirtan, was said to have smiled before vanishing. A little posthumous gratitude, maybe? Or just a final smirk before eternal rest. The Water case is rare in its formality, but not in its function. Across Iceland, ghost tales often carried social messages. Sometimes they targeted injustice. Other times they settled scores. In one tale, a man wrongly accused of theft dies and returns as a ghost, not to terrify, but to tell his friend where to find the real stolen goods. The living retrieve them, the truth comes out, and the dead man's honor is restored. Call it spectral whistle-blowing. Another time, a murdered shepherd appears to his killer every night, just standing silently at the foot of the bed. After weeks of this, The killer confesses to the local Goy, a chieftain-priest hybrid, and asks for public punishment. The ghost disappears. The legal record clears. Everyone sleeps easier. Historians point out that these stories serve more than narrative drama. They reinforce communal norms. If the justice system fails, or if it's too slow, the dead step in. And their methods are consistent. They don't scream, they don't chase. They just appear, watching, waiting, nudging the living toward confession or repair. Still, scholars argue over how seriously people took these accounts. Were they genuine hauntings, or strategic storytelling? Did someone really see the ghost, or was it a way to admit guilt without saying, "Okay, I did it"? One fringe theory suggests that some ghost stories functioned like community therapy. You couldn't say, "I'm haunted by grief," but you could say, "He stands by the fire every night." That's easier to understand. Easier to accept. And it worked both ways. Ghosts could shame the living into action, but they could also defend the innocent. In one preserved case, a man accused of sorcery claimed the ghost of his mother appeared in court to declare his virtue. She stood behind the priest during the trial, visible only to him, but he swore she placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "He's done no wrong." The priest believed him. Charges dropped. Okay, maybe not a watertight legal defense, but it says something about cultural priorities. A community that believes the dead care about truth is a community with long memories and short tolerance for loose ends. Even children's stories weren't exempt. Ghost tales were told around hearths not just to spook, but to teach. Mind your chores, or the drowned man will look in your window. Don't take what isn't yours, or the grave wife will call your name. Morality cloaked in mist. So tonight, as you imagine those sagas being whispered over seal oil lamps, picture this. The line between story and law, fear and fairness, wasn't as clear as you think. Sometimes, to solve a problem, you didn't need proof, you needed presence. And sometimes, a good ghost story was the only justice left in town. You're climbing now, not metaphorically, but up a rough path of volcanic stone, damp with moss and a little treacherous. It winds along a ravine that looks like it hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Wind whistles low through the rocks, and every so often you swear you hear a voice in it. Not screaming, just murmuring, like it's remembering. This is where you come to understand how the stories didn't just stay in people's homes or heads, they etched themselves into the land. In medieval Iceland, geography and ghost lore were intimately tied. Where you saw a spirit mattered almost as much as what it did. You didn't just say a ghost appeared, you said it appeared on the north slope of Hestfjall, just above the path where Gunnar fell. Because that place remembered. And memory, in Iceland, was often rooted in dirt and stone. Take, for example, the hill known as Gæsholma. From the 13th century onward, locals insisted it was haunted. Not just haunted, specifically haunted by the ghost of a woman whose husband had left her to starve during a famine. Her wail, they said, could be heard during harvest season, coming down from the rocks. Some farmers left offerings at the base each autumn, a bit of bread, a swatch of cloth. Not to feed her, but to acknowledge her. Mainstream historical fact. Icelanders named places after events, especially tragic or supernatural ones. There's Draugagill, Ghost Ravine, Crosshola, Cross Hills, where spirits were laid to rest, and the charmingly blunt Morris Field, named after a poltergeist who liked to slap people's horses. These place names made stories part of the physical map. They also warned travelers, tread lightly. This land remembers things you don't. And the land could be legally haunted. That's not a joke. Remember those sagas where ghosts were sighted in property disputes? Well, some parcels of land, particularly those with a history of strange happenings, were literally valued lower because of it. If a farm was known for sightings, disappearing livestock, Or that one time a skeleton knocked on the door asking for fish. Its resale value dropped. Prospective buyers demanded guarantees. In at least one known case, a man insisted a priest bless every corner of the barn before he'd sign the deed. Spiritual due diligence. Quirky but true, legal scribes sometimes added marginal notes to contracts that read like supernatural disclaimers. One fragment states, "No spirits seen since the blessing of 1289. May it remain so." That's not your average real estate pitch. But it wasn't just fields and houses. Roads had reputations. The path across Myrtle Sander, for instance, was feared for ghost sightings tied to shipwreck victims. Travelers reported feeling hands grip their arms or hearing voices cry, "Don't go alone." One account, preserved in a 15th century travel diary, mentions a man who stopped to rest and awoke with his boots filled with seawater, despite being 20 miles inland. Historians still argue whether these were coded warnings about natural dangers, quicksand, fog, sudden weather, or actual supernatural beliefs. But either way, the ghost stories stuck. And travelers took them seriously. In fact, it became common to recite protective verses while walking certain trails. Some were Christian blessings, others were older, half prayer, half spell. You might whisper, "Step light where she sleeps, and she'll let you pass." A verbal handshake with whatever haunted the hill. Another reason the land mattered. Burial practices. Not everyone got to rest in hallowed ground. Criminals, suicides, and unbaptized infants were often buried outside churchyards in marginal places like riverbanks, crossroads, or heathland. These sites became hotspots for ghost lore. The restless dead, denied Christian burial, were believed to linger near their graves. A particularly grim tale comes from northern Iceland, where a boy drowned after falling through the ice. He hadn't been baptized yet, and by church law, couldn't be buried inside the cemetery. So his parents, heartbroken, buried him near a bend in the river. For years afterward, locals claimed to hear a baby crying at dusk, always near the water. Eventually, a sympathetic priest conducted a private blessing at the site. After that, the crying stopped. It's a sad story, but also deeply human. And it shows how even in a rigid religious system, people still found ways to honor the dead. Even the improperly dead. And then, of course, there were the cairns, small stone mounds you might find dotting the hillsides. Some marked travel routes, yes. But others were memorials. And some, well, if you knock one over, best to apologize. Loudly. A popular belief held that each cairn had a keeper, a spirit who watched over the place, usually quietly. But if disrespected, they could retaliate with illness, nightmares, or a particularly nasty cow death. Seriously, medieval Icelanders had a lot of cow-related ghost anxiety. One fringe tidbit, in the Eastfjords, it was said that if you slept with your head on the north side of a hill believed to be haunted, you'd dream the spirit's last memory. Sometimes people did this on purpose, like ghostly tourism. Other times, it was a dare. Either way, the dreams were considered binding. You'd seen what the ghost saw. You had an obligation now. So yes, these stories weren't just floating fictions. They had addresses, coordinates, sometimes even directions, like take the third sheep path past the hot spring, then turn where the ravens circle. The physical world became a haunted manuscript. Modern scholars still puzzle over how deeply people believed. Were these tales metaphor, memory, or survival guide? Were they about ghosts or about grief, trauma, and the need to give meaning to inexplicable things? But belief isn't always tidy. And Iceland's geography, with its boiling geysers, silent glacier, and long, lonely dark, invites more than practicality. It demands reverence. So you pause on this ridge, wind tugging at your sleeves, and look out over the valley. Maybe you see nothing but snow and stone. Or maybe, just maybe, You feel something leaning against the edge of your awareness. A flicker. A presence. Nothing malevolent. Just watching. Just remembering. Your feet are sore, your thoughts a little foggy, and the moon is just brushing the tops of the cliffs as you follow a narrow stream down through a wooded glen. The trees are sparse, and the night carries a hush that makes you speak softer, even in your own head. This part of your journey is quieter not because the ghosts are gone, but because they've changed. Tonight, you're not dealing with vengeful spirits or soggy sailors who won't take a hint. You're listening to something older, subtler. The afterlife, according to the legal minds of medieval Iceland, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was administrative. Because yes, even death needed paperwork. Let's talk about wills arforetta, as they were called. Icelanders believed that your obligations didn't end when your pulse did. If you were wealthy, you had to sort out your estate, yes, but also your soul. A well-structured will could mean the difference between eternal peace and endless hauntings. And that's not just dramatic metaphor, it was taken very seriously. The legal documents left behind often specified not only which cousin got the cows, but also which priest should pray for your soul and for how long. These weren't casual suggestions. People paid for prayers. A lot. In fact, part of what kept churches afloat during the 13th and 14th centuries were these soul-oriented bequests. You give the abbey a few acres of pasture, they promise to say Mass for you every Thursday until the end of time. Or at least until their bookkeeping falls apart. Mainstream fact, this is where the Icelandic legal system overlaps with Catholic doctrine. Once Christianity spread, the idea of purgatory, a sort of divine DMV, took hold. Your soul might not shoot straight to heaven. You could get stuck. But enough prayers from the living? They worked like bribes at a very polite spiritual customs office. So writing a will became a deeply moral act. You weren't just distributing stuff. You were pleading your case to eternity. And if you left things out, if you forgot to forgive that one farmer or neglected to pay back your debts, well, guess what? You might get stuck. And then people would start seeing you. Cue the ghost. You've seen this before in the sagas, dead men returning to complain that their wishes weren't honored. A woman appearing in her son's dreams because he forgot to donate to a monastery. Or a man whispering to his old friend that he'd promised a slave his freedom, and no one carried it out. These weren't stories made to entertain. They were warnings. Because the dead could audit the living. Now here's a quirky tidbit that scholars love to argue about. The practice of speaking wills out loud. In Iceland, it wasn't always enough to write it down. You needed witnesses. You'd gather your family, maybe even your neighbors, and say your intentions aloud, preferably on your deathbed. The idea was that once spoken into the world, your words had power. And if you lied, or withheld something, well, the spirit world was listening too. In one case from a 14th century document fragment, a man's spirit appears after death, not because he was wronged, but because he felt guilty. He admitted, via haunting, that he'd lied during his spoken will, naming a cousin instead of the rightful heir. The haunting was interpreted as a form of repentance. The cousin gave up the inheritance. The real heir took over. The ghost, never seen again. Historians still debate whether these stories reflect genuine belief in ghostly agency or whether they were clever tools for correcting injustices posthumously. Some suggest that hauntings were culturally sanctioned ways to reverse legal decisions, like reopening a case on appeal, only the plaintiffs now translucent. And it wasn't just individuals. Entire families could suffer because of unresolved spiritual business. Some sagas describe haunted lineages where great-grandfathers failed to make things right, and generations later, the spirits still lingered. Children would be born pale and silent. Animals would shy away from the family farm. In these cases, the only solution was a collective ritual, public confession, land restitution, sometimes even a legal reenactment of the original crime. One family, the Galtasons of Eyjafjara, reportedly reenacted a murder that had happened over a century earlier. They used actors, read the old law, and then held a symbolic reconciliation in front of witnesses. Why? Because the ghost kept appearing to the youngest daughter in the smoke of the hearth, whispering, "You've forgotten my name." Was it true? Did the ghost really speak? Or was this collective guilt bubbling up in a culture obsessed with memory? Historians still argue. Here's another wrinkle. Icelandic legal documents often blended Christian and pre-Christian concepts. You'd find invocations to both God and land spirits. Some wills specified that offerings be made not just to the church, but also to the vetir, the local spirits of place. A kind of spiritual hedging. Just in case the saints were slow, maybe the hill spirits could help. One surviving will from 1323 ends with a strange clause, "And let there be peace between me and the sea, for it has taken enough." Scholars still scratch their heads at that one. Was it poetic? A metaphor? Or did this man genuinely believe the sea needed forgiving? And yet, doesn't that line make sense? In a land where geography is alive and memory soaks into the soil, why wouldn't you write an apology to a fjord? Back to our scene. You're walking through a little valley now, and the wind's dropped. In the stillness, you can almost imagine what it was like to hear a will read aloud in a stone hall lit only by fire. The old man's voice steady. The hush of listeners. Maybe a baby fusses. Someone coughs. And every ear, mortal or otherwise, leans forward. Because this isn't just inheritance. It's legacy. It's lore and longing tied into one. And if you get it wrong, the ghosts will let you know. So next time you imagine medieval Iceland as cold and silent, remember this. It was a place where even death had paperwork, and every word mattered not just to the living, but to whatever waited just beyond the hearthlight. You're standing now at the edge of a turf-covered cemetery, the stones crooked and soft-edged, like teeth worn down by the chewing of centuries. Moss coats the tops, and lichen fills the carved runes so thick you have to squint to read them. The names are old. So old you can't tell where the story ends and the memory begins. This is where the trail brings you, to the final reckoning of all those legal ghosts. Because tonight, you finish with what happens when the law can't resolve the haunting. When even prayers, apologies, and properly notarized documents fail. And when the ghost wins. Not every spirit in medieval Iceland came back seeking justice. Some were just angry, not misunderstood, not restless, just mean. And sometimes, even lawmen, the scribes, the chieftains, the priests threw up their hands and said, "We've done all we can." Someone fetch the necromancer. Yes, necromancy. We have to go there. Mainstream historical fact. While necromancy was outlawed by both church and secular codes, Icelandic sagas are full of people using it in secret. And not all necromancers were wild-eyed cultists. Some were respected healers, folk sages, or disgraced priests. People who knew how to ask the dead questions, usually through rituals involving bones, runes, or, oddly enough, dreams induced by sleeping on grave mounds. Because nothing says peaceful slumber like laying your head where a ghost lies angry. One such figure was Orgunna, a 14th century woman rumored to have spoken with winds. According to a fragmentary tale, she was hired to end a haunting that had tormented a fishing village for over a decade. Fishermen kept seeing the same spectral boy, always barefoot, walking along the shore. Boats overturned. Nets tangled. People drowned. Priests blessed the bay. Nothing changed. Orgunna came, slept 3 nights near the burial mound, and returned with this message: he waits for his father's name. Turns out, the boy had died out of wedlock, and no one had ever publicly named his father. The local council, reluctantly, reopened an old paternity case, and a year later, the sightings stopped. Quirky, yes, but also remarkably legalistic. Even the dead needed recognition. That leads us to the final kind of ghostly litigation, unresolvable cases where the haunting was so entrenched, so generational, that legal fixes weren't enough. In these stories, communities sometimes created ritual settlements, blending law, religion, and theater. They'd act out a trial for the ghost. Assign someone to defend the living and someone else to speak for the dead. At the end, they'd bury tokens, say prayers, and burn symbolic items like broken blades or old shoes. Apparently, shoes were spiritually suspicious. Historians still argue whether these were true events or literary inventions, but some documents do record the expenses for such rituals, payment to scribes, bread for witnesses, cloth for wrapping offerings. Which means something was definitely happening. And if that failed, there was always exile. No, not for the ghost, for the living. That's right. Some people just left. Packed up and abandoned their homes because the haunting wouldn't stop. We have legal records showing farms marked as deserted due to unrest. And no, unrest doesn't always mean taxes. Sometimes it meant a headless shepherd who sang at night. One such homestead was unoccupied for 70 years. When a new family finally moved in, they found a carved stone by the door that read, "He is quieter now." And that's not metaphor. That's legal haunting, with a history long enough to outlive any mortgage. Final quirky tidbit. In one 15th century contract, a landowner writes, "If the spirit still lingers, let him eat from my table, provided he pays in peace." That's the Icelandic spirit, right there. A bit tired. A bit sarcastic. And still willing to negotiate, even with the undead. So what does all this tell you? That Icelandic ghost stories weren't just creepy tales by the fire. They were records. Emotional, spiritual, and occasionally bureaucratic. A haunted ledger where memory met law. Even in death, there was process. Forms, hearings, prayers, negotiations. And if the dead didn't get what they were owed, be it justice, name, or just a proper burial, then Iceland's medieval society fully expected them to show up and complain. That idea of ghosts as not just terrifying but entitled makes medieval Iceland weirdly modern. These spirits weren't monsters. They were plaintiffs. Their hauntings were legal arguments left unfinished. So now, as you stand at the edge of this old cemetery, the wind brushing your cheek like a cool breath, you understand something deeper. The laws about ghosts weren't written out of fear. They were written out of respect. For the dead. For memory. For justice. And maybe for the occasional poltergeist who couldn't let go of a missing butter churn. You turn from the stones. The moon has climbed high. Your shadow walks beside you, long and quiet. Behind you, the hill holds its breath, just in case someone still needs to be heard. And now, as the last pages of this quiet journey close, let yourself settle. Let the thoughts slow. The old Icelandic laws, the ghosts that wandered sheep paths and courtrooms alike, they've done their part. You don't need to follow them anymore. Picture the landscape fading gently under a soft curtain of mist. No spirits waiting. No sagas whispering. Just stillness, and the soothing hush of wind through birch leaves. Maybe there's a turf-roofed house nearby, its windows glowing faintly. Inside, a single candle flickers on a wooden table. No ghosts at the door tonight, only rest. Let your breath soften with the silence. Feel your limbs get heavier, as though the moss beneath you has welcomed your presence. The stories are quiet now. The law has been read. The names remembered. Even the bitter ones have found their place in the earth. Drift, slowly, through this dim northern hush. Even the most unsettled spirit, given time, finds peace. And so do you.